The scent of ionized air and expensive leather filled Julian Croft's office on the 85th floor of the Omni Tower. Downtown Chicago sprawled below, a grid of glittering lights against the deepening twilight, its frenetic energy muted by triple-paned glass. Every surface, from the polished chrome desk to the minimalist art on the stark white walls, was a testament to calculated success and immense power. It was a space designed not for comfort, but for command, a sterile, silent kingdom built on algorithms and ruthless acquisitions. The only sound was the quiet hum of a server farm somewhere deep within the building, the digital heartbeat of his multi-billion-dollar tech empire. Julian stood before the window, not admiring the view, but seeing it as a conquered territory, a map of his influence. His reflection was a sharp silhouette in an impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit, a man who had everything and felt nothing. He turned as his phone chimed, the notification displaying a cascade of rising metrics. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips. The video he had uploaded less than an hour ago was a viral wildfire. It showed a Chicago police officer, his face flushed and seemingly aggressive, losing his composure during a routine traffic stop. Julian had meticulously edited the 45-second clip, cutting his own goading remarks and condescending tone, leaving only what appeared to be an unhinged officer berating a citizen. He had framed it perfectly, a masterclass in narrative manipulation. The public outrage was immediate and ferocious, a digital mob he had summoned with the tap of a screen. This surge of validation, of seeing thousands of strangers condemn a man he'd never met, was a familiar and satisfying substitute for genuine human connection. It was power in its purest, most modern form. The target of this digital onslaught, Officer Michael O'Connell, was at that moment sitting in the sterile briefing room of his precinct, the captain's words a dull roar in his ears. His uniform felt heavy, suffocating. He stared at his hands, calloused and strong, now trembling slightly on the table. He had seen the video. He had seen his own face, twisted by the selective lens of Julian's phone, turned into a monster for the world to judge. The context was gone, the provocation erased. All that remained was a lie that had traveled around the world before the truth could even put its boots on. The humiliation was a cold, physical weight in his chest, a stark and brutal rejection not just of his career, but of the very principles he had sworn to uphold. He was no longer a respected officer. He was a hashtag, a villain in a story he didn't write. The captain slid a tablet across the table. Internal Affairs will take your statement in the morning. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon, Mike. The phrase, delivered with bureaucratic finality, was the final blow. It wasn't a question or a negotiation. It was a disownment. Mike slowly, mechanically, unclipped his badge, the same one his father had worn, and placed it on the table. The small piece of metal, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a brand of shame. As it clattered softly on the wood, the sound echoed the shattering of his life, a sound that would haunt him long after he left the room, a man stripped of his identity by a stranger's casual cruelty. If this story has already touched you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. The days that followed the incident bled into a gray, featureless haze for Mike O'Connell. Administrative leave was a sterile term for a suffocating reality. He found himself confined to his small, two-bedroom apartment in Jefferson Park, the rhythmic drip of a faulty kitchen faucet marking the slow passage of time. The silence was the worst part. For 15 years, his life had been a symphony of city sounds, the crackle of the police radio, the wail of sirens, the constant chatter of colleagues. Now there was only the drip, the hum of the refrigerator, and the phantom echoes of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He'd paced the worn linoleum floor, from the living room window overlooking a rain-slicked street to the small kitchen, feeling like a caged animal whose world had shrunk to the size of his own failure. His daughter, 10-year-old Lily, became his anchor and his deepest source of pain. She was a bright, perceptive child with his late wife's kind eyes, and she knew something was deeply wrong. She'd find him staring blankly at the television, the screen reflecting a man hollowed out by a shame he couldn't explain to her. "Are you sick, Daddy?" she asked one afternoon, her small hand on his forehead. He forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster and assured her he was fine, just tired. But she saw the lie in his eyes, the deep-seated weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. He tried to maintain their routine pancakes for breakfast, homework at the kitchen table, but a heavy curtain of anxiety had fallen over their home, and she could feel its suffocating weight as much as he could. The online world was a relentless torrent of hate. Friends sent him screenshots thinking they were helping, but each one was a fresh stab. Strangers dissected the 45-second clip, calling him a thug, a disgrace, a menace. His face was plastered everywhere, a meme for police brutality. He was forced to delete his social media, but the poison had already seeped into his real life. A neighbor he'd known for years crossed the street to avoid him. When he went to the corner store for milk, he felt the burn of accusatory stares. He saw parents pull their children closer as he walked by the local park. The digital mob Julian Croft had unleashed had real-world consequences, turning his community, the one he had sworn to protect, into a landscape of suspicion and fear. He was an exile in his own neighborhood. Meanwhile, Julian Croft watched the storm he'd created from his sky-rise fortress. He followed the analytics, the trending hashtags, the outraged news segments, with a detached sense of accomplishment. His public relations team had crafted a statement painting him as a concerned citizen exposing a dangerous officer, a narrative the media eagerly consumed. His board of directors was ecstatic. "Brilliant move, Julian," said Marcus Thorne, the chairman, during a conference call. "You've positioned yourself as a man of the people, holding power accountable. The brand engagement is through the roof." Julian accepted the praise with a cool nod, the approval of his peers a familiar, hollow currency. He saw it not as a moral victory, but as a successful strategic play, a demonstration of his ability to shape reality to his will. The man at the center of it, Officer O'Connell, was merely a variable in an equation of power. Yet, in the silent hours of the night, when the city lights blurred into an impressionistic smear outside his window, a strange disquiet would settle over him. He would pour himself a glass of absurdly expensive whiskey, a Macallan 1926, and the manufactured triumph of the day would evaporate, leaving behind a familiar, cavernous emptiness. He'd walk through his sprawling, minimalist mansion in Lincoln Park, a $20 million monument to his success, its rooms filled with museum-quality art, but devoid of warmth or life. The echo of his footsteps on the polished marble floors was the only sound. He was the undisputed king of a silent, sterile castle, and he had never felt more alone. The victory over the anonymous cop brought him no joy, only a fleeting distraction from the profound void within. This void was carved out in his childhood. Julian's father, a ruthless old money industrialist, had raised him on a brutal diet of criticism and impossibly high expectations. Affection was transactional. Love was conditional upon achievement. He remembered standing in his father's grand study, a small, trembling boy holding a report card with a single B+, being told that second best is the first loser. That lesson became the core of his operating system. Vulnerability was a fatal weakness, and human connection was a liability. He had built his entire life as a fortress against the kind of emotional pain his father had so expertly inflicted, brick by brick, deal by deal, until the walls were so high and thick that nothing and no one could get in. His personal assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Claire, had worked for him for 5 years and knew his coffee order, his travel schedule, and his preferred brand of pen, but she knew nothing of the man himself. He communicated with her through curt emails and brief, impersonal directives. She was a function, a tool to optimize his time, not a person. One morning, she mentioned her son's upcoming school play, her voice tinged with parental pride. Julian simply stared at her, his expression blank, waiting for her to get to the point. The flicker of warmth in her eyes died, replaced by a professional mask. "The quarterly reports will be on your desk by noon," she said, her tone flat. He nodded, satisfied. The moment of potential connection had been identified and neutralized. Back in Jefferson Park, financial pressure began to mount for Mike. Administrative leave meant his overtime pay, which he relied on to make ends meet, was gone. The bills started to pile up: the mortgage on their small house, the car payment, Lily's tuition for her Catholic school. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, a stack of envelopes in front of him, the numbers swimming before his eyes. He had always been a provider, a man who took pride in his self-reliance. Now he felt a creeping sense of panic. He started eating less, telling Lily he wasn't hungry, so she could have a full meal. He sold his father's old watch, a treasured keepsake, for a few $100s to keep the electricity on. Each small sacrifice was a fresh wound to his pride, a secret shame he hid from his daughter. The breaking point came with an official letter from the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. He was the subject of a formal investigation that could lead to termination. The impersonal, bureaucratic language felt like a death sentence. Reading the words, Mike felt the floor drop out from under him. He thought of his wife, Sarah, who had died from cancer 3 years prior. She had always been his rock, the one who believed in him even when he doubted himself. He could almost hear her voice, telling him to fight, to not let this injustice define him. But the fight felt impossible. He was one man against a viral video, a public narrative, and the immense power of a billionaire. Despair was a cold tide, and it was pulling him under. It was Lily who unknowingly threw him a lifeline. She came home from school with a drawing she had made. It depicted him in his uniform, standing tall, with a superhero's cape flowing behind him. Next to him, she had drawn herself holding his hand. Underneath, she had written in wobbly letters, "My daddy, my hero." Looking at the simple, heartfelt drawing, something inside Mike shifted. He wasn't just a disgraced cop. He was Lily's father. He was her hero. He couldn't give up. For her, he had to fight. That simple piece of paper, filled with a child's unwavering love, became his reason to stand up, to seek justice not for his own sake, but for the future of the little girl who still saw a hero when she looked at him. His first step was contacting the police union, which assigned him a tired, overworked lawyer who offered little hope. "Public opinion is against you, Mike. They'll probably offer you a deal to resign quietly," the lawyer had said, his tone resigned. It was a dead end. But a friend from the force gave him the number of a civil rights attorney, a woman named Elena Ramirez. She worked pro bono for a small, non-profit firm, taking on cases the big firms wouldn't touch. She had a reputation as a tenacious fighter for the underdog. With a sliver of hope, Mike made the call, his voice hoarse as he explained his situation, feeling the familiar sting of shame as he recounted the events of that rainy afternoon. Elena Ramirez listened patiently on the other end of the line, her silence not one of judgment, but of careful consideration. She ran a small, cluttered office in the Pilsen neighborhood, a world away from the gleaming corporate law firms downtown. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen their share of injustice. "A video is not the whole truth, Officer O'Connell," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The law cares about context. Let me see the full, unedited bodycam footage. Let me see everything." For the first time in weeks, Mike felt a flicker of something other than despair. He felt heard. He felt like he might have a chance, however small, to reclaim his story from the man who had stolen it. The legal process began, a slow, grinding machine. Elena filed a civil lawsuit against Julian Croft for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking $5 million in damages. The amount was symbolic, a number designed to get Julian's attention. Julian's response was swift and brutal. He retained one of the city's most formidable law firms, a team of legal assassins known for burying opponents in paperwork and procedural delays. Their initial move was to file a motion to dismiss, calling the lawsuit frivolous and an attempt to extort a public figure. The battle lines were drawn, a small, underfunded nonprofit against a corporate titan with limitless resources. Julian's lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Richard Sterling, advised him to fight aggressively. "We can't show weakness," Sterling argued in Julian's office. "We paint O'Connell as an unstable officer with a history of complaints, looking for a payday. We bleed him dry in discovery. He'll fold." Julian agreed. the strategy appealing to his predatory instincts. It was business as usual. He authorized a team of private investigators to dig into every aspect of Mike's life, searching for any scrap of dirt they could use to discredit him. He saw the lawsuit as another hostile takeover, and he was determined to win at any cost, preserving his carefully constructed public image. The deposition was held in a sterile conference room at Sterling's law firm. Mike sat on one side of a long mahogany table with Elena, facing a team of 5 lawyers. Julian was present, sitting at the far end of the table, his expression a mask of bored indifference. For 8 hours, Sterling's team grilled Mike, their questions a relentless assault on his character and professionalism. They twisted his words, questioned his motives, and brought up a minor complaint from a decade earlier that had been dismissed. Mike, coached by Elena, remained calm and answered truthfully, but the process was a form of psychological torture designed to break him down and make him feel powerless. Through it all, Julian watched, silent and detached. He saw a man in a rumpled suit, looking tired and worn down, and felt a cold satisfaction. This was the natural order of things, the strong dominating the weak. He barely listened to the words, focusing instead on the power dynamics in the room. He was in complete control, his legal army systematically dismantling his opponent. He checked his phone for stock updates under the table, the legal proceedings a mere background noise to his far more important world of high-stakes finance and technology. He felt no empathy, no remorse. He felt only the familiar, reassuring hum of his own power. Elena's key move was a subpoena for the unedited footage from Julian's phone and the complete bodycam recording from Mike's uniform. As she predicted, Julian's legal team fought it tooth and nail. They filed motion after motion, claiming the phone data was private and the full bodycam footage was irrelevant. The 45-second clip speaks for itself, Sterling argued before a judge. The rest is a fishing expedition, but Elena was relentless. My client's entire life has been destroyed by a clip that my opponent admits he edited. The court and a jury have a right to see the full context. The truth is not a fishing expedition, Your Honor. It's a right. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, agreed with Elena. She ordered Julian to produce the original, an edited video from his phone, and compelled the CPD to release the full, unredacted bodycam footage to both legal teams. It was the first major victory for Mike and Elena. When Elena called Mike to tell him the news, he felt a surge of adrenaline. The truth was finally coming. He was terrified of what it would mean, of reliving that moment, but he was more terrified of living the rest of his life under the shadow of a lie. The complete footage held the key, the full story of that rainy afternoon. Back in his office, Julian was furious. How could this happen? He snarled at Sterling over the phone. I pay you millions to control these situations. Sterling, ever calm, assured him they could manage it. We'll frame it, Julian. We'll say you edited it for brevity, for social media. We'll argue the officer's subsequent breakdown is proof of his instability. The explanation was plausible, a standard move from the corporate crisis management playbook. Julian reluctantly agreed, but for the first time, a crack appeared in his armor of certainty. He hadn't wanted anyone to see the full video. He hadn't wanted them to see his own behavior, his own arrogance in its raw and filtered state. As part of the discovery, Elena's team began researching Mike's history as an officer. They uncovered a thick file of commendations. He had received a life-saving award for pulling a family from a burning car. He was recognized for de-escalating a tense hostage situation without a shot being fired. He volunteered for a youth boxing program in his precinct, mentoring at-risk kids. Elena compiled a dossier, not of a monster, but of a dedicated, compassionate public servant. She sent a summary to Julian's legal team, a clear signal that the character assassination strategy they were planning would be met with a mountain of countervailing evidence. Julian, against his lawyer's advice, read the file. He expected to find it boring, irrelevant. But as he scrolled through the commendations, a strange feeling began to stir within him. He saw a photo of Officer O'Connell shaking hands with the mayor, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face. He read a quote from the mother of the family, he'd saved from the fire, calling him their guardian angel. He saw a picture of Mike with a group of teenagers at the boxing gym, looking more like a proud older brother than a cop. These images didn't align with the unstable aggressor his lawyers were paid to create. They depicted a man of substance, a man admired by his community. One evening, driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't explain, Julian had one of his investigators send him a file on O'Connell's personal life. It was a violation of his own rules, a departure from his detached, strategic approach. The file was thin. It detailed the death of his wife, Sarah, from ovarian cancer. It mentioned his sole custody of their daughter, Lily. It included a recent photo, taken by the investigator from a distance, of Mike and Lily sitting on a park bench, sharing an ice cream cone. Mike was looking at his daughter with an expression of such profound, unguarded love that it made Julian physically uncomfortable. He quickly closed the file, an unfamiliar emotion coiling in his gut. He found himself thinking of his own childhood, a lonely existence in a house full of staff, but empty of affection. He remembered being 10, the same age as Lily, and waiting by the window for his father to come home, only for his father's car to drive past, heading to yet another late-night business dinner. He had never been looked at with the kind of love he saw in the photograph of Mike and Lily. The realization was sharp and painful, a shard of ice in his chest. He pushed the feeling away, dismissing it as a moment of weakness. He was Julian Croft. He did not feel. He conquered. The pressure from his board of directors was intensifying. The lawsuit was generating negative press, and the stock price had dipped slightly. "This needs to go away, Julian," Marcus Thorne told him. "Settle it, kill it, whatever it takes. Just make it disappear. This is a distraction we don't need before the cue for earnings call." The message was clear. The company's image was paramount. A protracted, ugly legal battle with a sympathetic cop was bad for business. Julian was trapped between the board's demand for a swift, quiet victory and the judge's order to release the full, damning video evidence. His carefully controlled world was beginning to fray at the edges. A few days later, a major news outlet published a sympathetic profile of Officer O'Connell. It told the story of his career, his wife's death, and his dedication to his daughter. It featured interviews with people he had helped, with kids from the boxing gym, and with fellow officers who called him a model cop. The article didn't mention Julian by name, but it painted a powerful portrait of the man whose life had been appended by a viral video. Public opinion, once so firmly against Mike, began to show signs of shifting. People started asking questions, wondering about the other side of the story. The narrative Julian had created was beginning to crumble. Julian read the article in his silent office, the city lights twinkling below like a distant, indifferent galaxy. He felt a growing sense of dread, an emotion he hadn't experienced since he was a child in his father's study. The story humanized O'Connell in a way he had deliberately tried to avoid. He was no longer just a variable, a pawn in a game. He was a widower, a father, a decorated officer. He was a human being, and Julian was the one who had tried to destroy him, not for any real transgression, but simply because he had been an inconvenience, a minor obstacle to his important schedule. His lawyers received the full, unedited bodycam footage. Sterling scheduled a meeting to review it with Julian. "We need to prepare for how the other side will use this," Sterling said, his tone all business. They sat in a high-tech screening room, the large screen dark and waiting. Julian felt strange reluctance to watch. He knew what was on the tape. He knew what he had said, how he had acted. He had been so certain of his power, his right to belittle the officer. Now, faced with the prospect of seeing his own unedited behavior, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in decades: shame. The video began. The quality was grainy, the audio filled with the sound of rain and passing traffic. It showed the entire 15-minute interaction. It captured Julian's entitled rage, his condescending questions, his threats to have Mike's job. "Do you have any idea who I am?" His own voice sneered from the speakers, and he flinched. He sounded petty, arrogant, and cruel. He saw Mike's response, his unwavering professionalism, his calm, patient attempts to de-escalate a situation that Julian was actively inflaming. The 45-second viral clip was a grotesque distortion of the truth. The traffic stop concluded on the video. Julian's car sped away, but the camera kept rolling. Mike O'Connell walked slowly back to his patrol car, the exhaustion evident in his posture. He leaned against the driver's side door, out of sight of the street, and the mask of professionalism fell away. He let his head hang, and a ragged breath escaped his lips. The camera positioned on his chest captured the movement as he slumped against the vehicle. It was a moment of pure, private despair. He was no longer a uniform. He was just a man, overwhelmed and alone in the rain. Then came the moment that would change everything. The bodycam's microphone picked up a faint, choked whisper. Mike wasn't speaking to anyone, just to himself, a raw exhalation of his deepest fear. "What am I going to do?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "What if I lose my job? How will I take care of Lily?" The words were barely audible, but in the silent, darkened screening room, they landed with the force of a physical blow. A father's terror, naked and absolute, not fear for himself, but for his child. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, never intended for anyone to see. For Julian, the world stopped. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart for 40 years crumbled to dust in an instant. The whisper echoed in the vast emptiness inside him, filling it with a crushing weight. He wasn't just watching a video. He was witnessing the soul of a man he had tried to break. He saw the face of the 10-year-old girl in the photograph, and he heard her father's desperate whisper. The strategic game was over. The stock prices, the board members, the legal maneuvering, it all vanished. All that was left was the horrifying, undeniable truth of what he had done. Richard Sterling paused the video. "Okay," he said, turning to Julian, his face a mask of professional concern. "This is problematic, but we can spin it. We'll argue it shows he was already emotionally unstable before." He trailed off. He was no longer talking to his client. He was talking to a man who looked like he had seen a ghost. Julian's face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. The mask of indifference had shattered, and what lay beneath was something raw and unfamiliar. He was staring at the screen, at the frozen image of Mike O'Connell's despair, and seeing his own monstrous reflection. Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked out of the screening room without a word, leaving his legal team in stunned silence. He went to his office, the one on the 85th floor, and stood before the window. But he no longer saw a conquered kingdom. He saw a city full of people like Mike O'Connell, people with families, fears, and loves, people whose lives he could shatter with a casual act of cruelty. The power he had so desperately coveted now felt like a toxic poison. For the first time, Julian Croft felt the full, crushing weight of his own actions. Remorse, true and profound, was a terrifying new sensation. He stayed in his office all night, the unedited video playing on a loop in his mind. He saw his own sneering face. He heard Mike's professional tone. But most of all, he heard the whisper. "How will I take care of Lily?" It was a question a father asks, a question born of pure love. It was a question Julian's own father had never had to ask, not because of love, but because of an abundance of money. Julian had inherited the money and the power, but he had missed out on the fundamental human emotion that drove the desperate question. He had traded his humanity for an empire, and he was only now realizing the abysmal nature of his bargain. The next morning, Claire found him still in his office, wearing the same suit from the day before, his tie loosened. He looked exhausted, but his eyes held a clarity she had never seen before. "Cancel my morning," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Get me everything you can on Officer Michael O'Connell. The commendations, the news articles, the boxing gym he volunteers at, everything. And get Elena Ramirez on the phone. I need to speak with her. Directly." Claire, surprised by the unprecedented request and the change in his demeanor, simply nodded and went to carry out his orders, sensing that a seismic shift had just occurred. While Julian was experiencing his moral awakening, Mike and Lily were facing a new crisis. An eviction notice was posted on their apartment door. With his pay suspended, Mike had fallen 2 months behind on rent. The stark official document was a tangible symbol of his failure. He tried to hide it from Lily, but she saw it, her young face crumpling with fear. "Are we going to have to leave our home, Daddy?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hugged her tightly, the cheap paper of the notice crinkling against his back, and whispered, "I won't let that happen. I promise." It was a promise he had no idea how he could possibly keep. Elena Ramirez, meanwhile, was preparing for the next stage of the legal battle. She knew the bodycam footage was their bombshell, the key to proving Julian's malice. She planned to introduce it in court, to let a jury see the full, unvarnished truth. She was building her case brick by brick, preparing to go to war for Mike's reputation and future. She believed in the system, in the idea that, even against a mountain of money and power, the truth could prevail. She was ready for the fight of her professional life, unaware that her opponent was in the process of surrendering before the battle had even truly begun. Julian spent the day immersed in the details of Mike O'Connell's life. He read the story of how Mike had used his own money to buy new equipment for the youth boxing gym. He read a letter from a teenager Mike had mentored, who was now the first in his family to go to college. He learned that Mike visited his wife's grave every Sunday without fail, to leave a single white rose, her favorite flower. Each detail was a chisel, chipping away at the marble facade of Julian's cynicism, revealing the vulnerable human being he had long ago buried beneath layers of ambition and fear. Late that afternoon, he finally connected with Elena Ramirez. His lawyers had strongly advised against it, but Julian insisted. "Miss Ramirez," he began, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance, "I have seen the full bodycam footage." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I imagine it was illuminating," Elena finally said, her tone cautious, wary of a trap. "It was," Julian replied, his own voice quiet. "I have a proposal to discuss, not through our lawyers, directly with you, and with Officer O'Connell. I believe it's time to stop fighting and start talking." Elena was suspicious, but she was also a pragmatist. A direct conversation was a risk, but it could also be a shortcut to a resolution that her client desperately needed. She agreed to a meeting, but on her terms, at her office, a neutral ground where Mike would feel safe. Julian accepted without hesitation. The meeting was set for the following week, just days before the next major court hearing. The stage was being set for a confrontation, but one that would be entirely different from the legal battle everyone had been anticipating. For the next few days, Julian was a changed man. He was quiet, introspective. He ignored the frantic calls from his board and his legal team. He spent his time not looking at stock tickers or market analyses, but at the file on Mike Owed, a business problem to be solved. It was a human debt to be repaid. The impending meeting was not a negotiation for him. It was the first step in a long, uncertain journey toward atonement. Mike, informed by Elena of the proposed meeting, was filled with a mix of dread and cautious hope. The idea of facing the man who had tried to ruin him was terrifying. What could Julian Croft possibly have to say to him? Yet, Elena's intuition told her something had shifted. "I don't know what this is, Mike," she confessed, but he sounded different. "We go, we listen. We don't agree to anything, but we listen." Mike agreed, trusting her judgment. He would face his tormentor, not knowing that he was about to meet a man as broken and desperate for redemption as he was for justice. The day of the meeting arrived. Julian drove himself, taking a simple sedan from the company's motor pool instead of his usual chauffeured Bentley. He drove through the bustling, vibrant streets of Pilsen, a part of the city he had only ever seen from 85 floors up. The world at street level felt more real, more alive. He parked in front of a modest storefront office, the name Ramirez Law and Advocacy painted on the glass. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of grilled corn from a street vendor, and felt a profound sense of anxiety. This was more terrifying than any billion-dollar negotiation. Inside, Mike O'Connell was waiting with Elena. He wore his only suit, one he usually reserved for funerals and weddings. He stood when Julian entered, his posture stiff, his face a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Julian stopped a few feet away, his expensive suit looking out of place in the cluttered, humble office. The two men looked at each other, the billionaire who had everything and the cop who had lost almost everything. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and a heavy, shared history of pain. There were no lawyers, no assistants, just the three of them in a small room, with the truth hovering between them. Julian's eyes met Mike's. For a long moment, neither spoke. Julian saw not the aggressive thug from his edited video, but a tired father, a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He saw the quiet dignity in his eyes, the deep lines of stress etched around his mouth. And in that moment, Julian's last defense, his final remnant of pride, crumbled. He opened his mouth to speak, the carefully rehearsed words of his lawyers forgotten. What came out was something simpler, something more honest, a single word that carried the weight of his profound and agonizing regret. He started, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain. The word hung in the air, unfinished but understood. He was sorry. The admission, the beginning of a confession, was not a strategic move, but a surrender. It was the first honest sound Julian Croft had made in years, and it echoed in the small office, signaling the end of one chapter and the terrifying, uncertain beginning of another. For Mike, hearing that crack in the billionaire's voice was more shocking than any legal argument. It was the sound of a fortress beginning to fall, and it hinted at the possibility that justice might not just be about winning in court, but about reclaiming a shared humanity. Elena watched the two men, her role as a lawyer momentarily suspended. She was witnessing something more profound than a legal settlement. She saw the potential for a genuine reckoning, a moment where the vast chasm between two disparate worlds could be bridged by a simple, terrifyingly human emotion: remorse. The outcome of this meeting was no longer certain, but for the first time, she felt that it might lead to a resolution that was not just legal, but truly just. The path forward was unclear, but the first, most difficult step had just been taken in that small, cluttered office. The internal conflict within Julian had reached its zenith. His entire identity was built on the foundation of being infallible, powerful, and in control. To admit fault, especially to the man he had wronged, was to tear down that foundation. It was a form of self-destruction. Yet, the alternative to continue the charade, to live with the knowledge of the pain he had caused, to be haunted by the image of Mike's despair and the sound of his whispered fear, was a far worse fate. He had to choose between the man he had been and the man he was terrified he might have to become. As he stood in that office, he thought of his father's relentless motto: never apologize, never explain. It's a sign of weakness. For his entire life, he had lived by that creed. But looking at Mike O'Connell, he realized the profound lie at its core. True weakness wasn't in admitting a mistake. True weakness was the inability to feel, the cowardice of hiding behind a wall of power and money. True weakness was what he had been his entire life. The meeting was not just about making things right with Mike. It was about Julian saving himself from the empty prison he had built. The board of directors, however, remained a significant external obstacle. Marcus Thorne had called him that morning, demanding an update. "Richard Sterling tells me you're meeting with the officer against his advice. What are you doing, Julian? Don't let this man's sob story cloud your judgment. The company comes first. Crush him and move on." The directive was a stark reminder of the world he belonged to, a world where empathy was a liability and human collateral was an accepted cost of doing business. To follow his conscience meant betraying that world and facing the professional consequences. This created the central conflict for the climax: Julian's burgeoning conscience versus his corporate responsibilities, and the powerful men who expected him to be ruthless. The courtroom would be the stage where this battle would be fought. He could follow his lawyer's script, protect his company, and save his career, but lose his soul. Or he could choose the truth, accept the consequences, and take the first step toward becoming a man his father would have despised, but a man he himself could finally respect. The choice was his alone, and it would define the rest of his life. The courtroom was a theater of manufactured tension. Sunlight struggled through the tall, arched windows of the Cook County Courthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the heavy air. The room was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public, all drawn by the high-profile defamation case of the street cop versus the tech mogul. The low murmur of the crowd was a constant hum beneath the formal proceedings. Julian Croft sat beside his legal team at the polished defense table, looking every bit the corporate titan in a charcoal gray suit. Across the aisle, Mike O'Connell sat with Elena Ramirez, his posture straight, his face pale but resolute. He looked smaller in this grand, intimidating space, an ordinary man caught in the gears of a machine far bigger than himself. A deep, oppressive silence fell as the judge called the court to order. Richard Sterling, Julian's lead counsel, began his cross-examination of Mike, who was now on the witness stand. Sterling's voice was smooth, a silken weapon he wielded with surgical precision. He paced before the witness box, a predator circling its prey. "Officer O'Connell," he began, his tone deceptively gentle, "would you describe yourself as having a temper?" Mike, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, answered calmly, "No, sir. I would describe myself as professional." Sterling smirked. "Professional? Is that what you call the behavior we see in the video that millions of people have now witnessed?" He didn't wait for an answer, instead launching into a series of rapid-fire questions designed to paint Mike as an aggressive, unstable officer, unfit for duty. For over an hour, the assault continued. Sterling brought up every minor incident from Mike's 15-year career, twisting commendations into signs of recklessness and de-escalations into failures to act decisively. He presented out-of-context quotes from old performance reviews, chipping away at Mike's credibility with relentless, clinical cruelty. Mike answered each question with a quiet, strained dignity, his voice never wavering, though a nerve twitched in his jaw. He refused to be baited, refused to show the anger Sterling was so desperate to provoke. In the front row of the gallery, Lily sat next to a family friend, her small face a mask of confusion and hurt as she watched a stranger tear her father apart. She clutched a small, hand-drawn picture of her dad as a superhero, a talisman against the poison filling the room. Julian watched the proceedings with a growing sense of revulsion. This was the strategy he had approved, the game he had paid millions to play. But seeing it unfold, seeing the quiet suffering on Mike O'Connell's face and the pain in his daughter's eyes, was unbearable. He felt a profound disconnect from the man at the defense table, from the entire cynical performance. Richard Sterling's voice, once so reassuringly powerful, now sounded hollow and cruel. Julian's gaze kept drifting from Mike's dignified composure to Lily's small, frightened form in the gallery. He saw himself in her, a child watching a parent be publicly diminished, and the echo of his own past pain was a deafening roar in his ears. The fortress he had built was collapsing from the inside out. The turning point came when Elena Ramirez, on redirect, requested that the full, unedited bodycam footage be played for the court. Sterling objected vehemently, but the judge, citing the need for complete context, overruled him. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the large screen flickered to life. The raw, grainy footage filled the room, the sound of rain, the passing cars, Julian's own sneering, entitled voice berating a calm and professional officer. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery as they witnessed the stark contrast between the viral clip and the unvarnished truth. Julian could feel the weight of every eye in the room shifting toward him, a collective judgment that felt far heavier than any legal verdict. He couldn't look away from the screen, forced to watch his own moral ugliness on full display. The footage continued past the point where his own car sped away. The courtroom watched as Officer O'Connell slumped against his patrol car, his composure finally breaking in a moment of private despair. A profound hush fell over the room, the only sound the faint hiss of the audio track. Then it came, the whisper. "What am I going to do? What if I lose my job? How will I take care of Lily?" The words, barely audible, yet utterly devastating, filled the silent courtroom. It was the sound of a father's heart breaking. Mike O'Connell flinched on the stand, closing his eyes as his deepest fear was laid bare for the world to hear. In the gallery, Lily began to cry softly, finally understanding the depth of her father's pain. That whisper was the final blow. It shattered the last remaining fragment of Julian's detachment. It was no longer a legal case. It was a human tragedy he had authored. He saw the full scope of the devastation he had wrought, the ripple effects of a single arrogant act. He had not just attacked a man's career. He had threatened a father's ability to care for his child, the most sacred of responsibilities. The immense wealth, the global company, the towering skyscraper, all of it felt like ash in his mouth. In that moment of horrifying clarity, Julian Croft saw himself for what he truly was, a profoundly impoverished man, bankrupt of the only things that truly mattered. Richard Sterling, ever the performer, rose as the video ended. He attempted to spin the moment to their advantage. "As you can see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice oozing false sympathy, "this is a man who is clearly emotionally unstable, on the verge of a breakdown long before my client even." He never got to finish the sentence. "That's enough." A voice cut through the courtroom, sharp and absolute. All heads turned. Julian Croft was on his feet, his face pale, his eyes blazing with an intensity no one had ever seen from him before. He took a step forward, away from the defense table, his multi-million-dollar legal team forgotten. "Mr. Croft, sit down," the judge commanded, her voice stern. Richard Sterling rushed to Julian's side, grabbing his arm. "Julian, what are you doing? Sit down," he hissed. Julian shook him off, his gaze fixed on Mike O'Connell, who was staring back at him from the witness stand, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "No," Julian said, his voice ringing with newfound authority, an authority that came not from power, but from a painful, liberating honesty. "I will not sit down, and I will not be silent for one more second." He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to make a statement." The judge, intrigued by the unprecedented turn of events, hesitated for a moment and then nodded slowly. "Proceed, Mr. Croft, but be warned, anything you say is on the record." Julian took a deep breath and turned, not to the jury, but to the man on the witness stand. "Officer O'Connell." "Mike," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I am the one who was unstable that day. I was arrogant, I was cruel, and I was wrong. What you saw on that video, my behavior, was inexcusable." The confession hung in the stunned silence of the courtroom. His own lawyers looked on in horror, their carefully constructed case imploding before their eyes. "I edited the video," Julian continued, the words pouring out of him now, a torrent of long overdue truth. "I did it deliberately. I cut out my own provocations, my own disgusting sense of entitlement to make you look like a monster. I wanted to hurt you, to ruin you, because you challenged my authority for a few moments on a rainy street. I used my power and my platform to create a lie, and I unleashed a mob on you and your family. I did this. It was not a mistake. It was a malicious, calculated act, and it was born out of a profound emptiness in my own life." He was no longer just admitting legal fault. He was confessing a sickness of the soul. He then turned his gaze to the jury box, his eyes sweeping over their shocked faces. "For years, I have measured my life by stock prices, by market share, by the height of the buildings I own. I built an empire of glass and steel, but I lived in a moral wasteland. I saw people not as human beings, but as obstacles or assets. Officer O'Connell was just an obstacle, and I tried to crush him. The law will determine the financial damages I owe him, but I know that no amount of money can ever fully repair the damage I have caused to his reputation, his peace of mind, and his family." His voice cracked as he looked back at Mike, whose own eyes were now glistening with unshed tears. "The strength in this room is not at the defense table. It's on that witness stand. It's the strength of a man who has endured a storm of lies with a dignity I can only dream of possessing. The real poverty in this room was mine. The moral bankruptcy was mine. He was publicly dismantling the very persona he had spent a lifetime creating, exposing his own flaws with a terrifying vulnerability. It was an act of self-immolation, but it felt like the first clean breath he had taken in decades. Finally, he looked toward the gallery, his eyes finding Lily, and to his daughter, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with a profound and aching regret. "I am so deeply sorry for the pain I caused your father, and for the fear I caused you. Your father is not what I made him out to be. He is a good man. He is a hero." He held her gaze for a moment, a silent plea for an absolution he knew he did not deserve. The image of his own lonely childhood flashed before his eyes, and he understood he had almost inflicted a similar parentless fate on her. With that, he fell silent, the raw emotion of his confession lingering in the air. He stood alone in the center of the courtroom, stripped bare of his power and prestige, exposed and vulnerable. He had given up everything: his case, his reputation, perhaps even his company. The silence was broken by a single sound, a quiet sob from the jury box. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman, was openly weeping. Julian had not just confessed to a crime. He had delivered a sermon on the nature of human decency, and his words had reached the core of everyone who heard them. Richard Sterling slumped into his chair, his face ashen. His case was not just lost, it was annihilated. Elena Ramirez reached across her table and placed a hand on Mike's arm, a gesture of quiet support. Mike O'Connell simply stared at Julian Croft, the anger and hatred that had sustained him for months slowly dissolving, replaced by a complex mixture of shock, pity, and a grudging, unbelievable sense of grace. In a stunning, world-altering moment, he saw not a monster, but a broken man, desperately trying to find his way back to the light. The legal battle was over, but the human story had just truly begun. The fallout from Julian's courtroom confession was immediate and seismic. The story exploded across the globe, no longer about a rogue cop, but about the dramatic redemption of a fallen titan. News outlets that had once vilified Mike O'Connell now championed him as a symbol of integrity, while Julian Croft became an object of intense fascination, a cautionary tale, and an unlikely hero all at once. The day after his testimony, he formally resigned as CEO of his company. In a terse press release, he stated he was stepping down to focus on personal and philanthropic endeavors. The resignation sent shockwaves through the financial world, but for Julian, it was a quiet, necessary amputation, severing the last tie to a life that had nearly cost him his soul. He walked out of the Omni Tower for the last time, not as a king leaving his castle, but as a pilgrim starting a long journey. True to his word, Julian moved to make amends in a way that went far beyond legal obligation. He instructed his new, humbled legal team to offer a settlement that was staggering in its generosity. It wasn't the $5 million Mike had initially sought. It was a $25 million trust, structured to provide for Mike and Lily for the rest of their lives, ensuring Lily's education through any university she chose. It was an amount designed not just to compensate, but to heal, to provide a fortress of security against the world's uncertainties. Julian saw it as the first tangible act of his atonement, a transfer of wealth that felt more meaningful than any billion-dollar acquisition he had ever made. It was the first time his money had ever felt truly valuable. With the settlement finalized, Julian liquidated a significant portion of his assets, pouring over $500 million of his personal fortune into a new, ambitious project, the Veritas Foundation. He established the nonprofit with a clear and urgent mission to combat digital misinformation, to provide legal and psychological support for victims of online shaming and cyberbullying, and to fund educational programs promoting digital ethics and media literacy. He worked tirelessly, not from a sky-rise office, but from a modest, rented space, surrounded by a small team of passionate advocates. The work was grueling and complex, but it filled the cavernous void within him. For the first time, he was building something not for profit or power, but for people. Mike O'Connell, his name and reputation fully restored, was reinstated to the Chicago Police Department with a public apology from the commissioner. He was hailed as a hero within the force and the city. With the financial security from the settlement, he could have retired, traveled the world, and left his old life behind. But Mike wasn't a man defined by money. He bought a comfortable but modest house in a quiet neighborhood, ensuring Lily had a yard to play in and a stable home. He then put his uniform back on. He went back to work because he believed in it. He believed in helping people, in being part of a community. His character, tested by fire, had emerged stronger and more resolute than ever before. Lily thrived in their new environment. The fear that had shadowed her young eyes was replaced by the bright, easy laughter of a child who felt safe. She excelled in her new school, made new friends, and her drawing of "My Daddy, My Hero" now hung in a proud frame in their living room. Mike, free from the crushing weight of financial anxiety and public shame, could be the father he always wanted to be: present, patient, and joyful. He and Lily would spend their weekends exploring the city's museums, going to baseball games, and simply enjoying the quiet, peaceful rhythm of a life that had been so nearly destroyed, now blessedly restored. Months passed. Julian's foundation began making a real impact, successfully lobbying for stronger legislation against digital defamation and funding a crisis hotline that had already helped hundreds of people. He never gave interviews or sought the spotlight, preferring to work behind the scenes. He had sold his mansion and his Bentley, now living in a simple downtown apartment and taking the L train to work. His life was smaller, quieter, but infinitely richer. The ghost of his father's disapproval, once a constant tormentor, had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose he had never known was possible. He was discovering the profound satisfaction of giving rather than taking. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian sent a simple, hesitant text message to a number Elena Ramirez had provided him. "There's a park near my old office. Lincoln Park. I go there sometimes. If you and Lily were ever there, I'd like to see you." He didn't expect a reply, but a few hours later, his phone buzzed. "We could be there Saturday, around 2. The reply was from Mike. There was no anger, no accusation, just a simple statement of fact. Julian felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought him to his knees. It was a second chance he knew he hadn't earned, but one he was determined to honor. He saw them by the duck pond. Mike was pushing Lily on a swing, her laughter carrying on the cool breeze. Julian approached slowly, his heart pounding. He wore simple jeans and a sweater, a man stripped of all his former armor. Mike saw him and gave the swing one last gentle push, walking over to meet him. They stood in silence for a moment, the vast social chasm that once separated them now just a few feet of grass in a public park. "Mr. Croft," Mike said, his voice neutral but not unkind. "Julian," he replied, his own voice quiet. "Please?" Just Julian. It was an offering, a request to be seen not as a mogul or a defendant, but as a man. Lily ran up, holding a fallen leaf, a kaleidoscope of red and gold. She looked up at Julian with a child's open curiosity, devoid of the judgment of adults. "Hi," she said simply. Julian knelt down, so he was at her eye level. He had no idea what to say, how to articulate the ocean of regret he felt. "Hi, Lily," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a beautiful leaf." She smiled, a bright, uncomplicated thing, and held it out for him to see. In her simple, trusting gesture, Julian felt a glimmer of absolution, a sense of peace that all his billions could never buy. They didn't talk about the trial, the video, or the money. They talked about the changing seasons, about the Cubs, about Lily's upcoming school project. It was a simple, normal conversation, yet it was the most profound one of Julian's life. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Mike extended his hand. "Thank you, Julian," he said. It was for everything and nothing at all. Julian took it, his grip firm. "No, Mike," he said, looking at him and at his daughter, with eyes full of a new, hard-won humanity. "Thank you." It was the beginning of an unlikely friendship, a quiet understanding that true wealth is measured not in what you own, but in the human connections you have the courage to build. 5 years later, the Veritas Foundation was a national leader in the fight for digital ethics. Julian, now in his early 50s, was a respected, if reclusive, figure in the world of philanthropy. He was often a guest lecturer at universities, speaking to young people about the responsibilities that come with power. He never mentioned his own story, but its lessons informed every word he spoke. He looked older, the sharp edges of his ambition softened into lines of wisdom around his eyes. He found his contentment not in boardrooms, but in the quiet, steady work of trying to make the world a slightly kinder, more truthful place. Mike O'Connell was now Detective O'Connell, a respected member of the Violent Crimes Division. His integrity and calm demeanor had made him a natural leader. He occasionally consulted with Julian's foundation, sharing his perspective as a law enforcement officer on the real-world impact of online hate. Lily was a bright, confident 15-year-old, the captain of her high school soccer team, with a fierce sense of justice she had learned from her father. The trust Julian had established remained largely untouched, a safety net Mike hoped she would use for her own dreams, whatever they might be. The final scene finds Julian at a community fundraiser for a youth center in Pilsen, an event partially sponsored by his foundation. He's not at the head table or on the stage. He's just one of the volunteers serving food. He sees a familiar face across the crowded room. Detective Mike O'Connell, off duty, is there with Lily. They catch each other's eye and share a simple, warm nod of mutual respect. Julian watches as Mike puts a proud arm around his daughter's shoulders. Julian smiles, a genuine, peaceful smile. He had lost an empire, but in its place, he had found his own humanity, a treasure of infinitely greater worth. What is the one thing you value more than any amount of money? Leave a little heart if you believe love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in human kindness.